Olivia Harrington pressed the brakes hard the moment the owl appeared. At dawn, on a foggy mountain road in Colorado, she found herself staring into the largest pair of blue eyes she had ever seen. The owl stood in the middle of the deserted road, unmoving. It seemed to return Olivia's gaze, as though it had been waiting for her. She stepped out of her patrol vehicle, heart still pounding. The engine's rumble mingled with the morning silence. A chill wind brushed against her cheeks as she took a cautious step forward. Despite her training and years of service as a forest ranger, she had never been this close to a wild owl before. Feathers speckled gray and white glistened with the faint light that broke through the shifting fog. "Easy there," Olivia said, keeping her voice gentle. She didn't want to startle the bird. Drawing nearer, she noticed something metallic on the owl's leg. It looked like a delicate piece of jewelry, or perhaps a tag. If the owl was tagged for research, she thought, it could explain why it was so calm. Yet everything about this creature felt unusual. Its size, its almost watchful demeanor, and those piercing blue eyes. Through her radio, a crackling voice interrupted the hush. A colleague's alert crackled through. "Be advised, missing hiker identified as Robert Callahan. Last seen near the northeastern ridge. All units requested to keep an eye out." Olivia's breath caught in her throat. The name Robert Callahan had been circling the station for days, each passing hour dimming hopes of finding him alive. She lowered her radio and inched closer to the owl. On the bird's leg, secured by a small strip of leather, was a tiny pendant. Olivia bent down to see it better. The words engraved were unmistakable. "For Elise, come back safe." The missing hiker's wife was named Elise Callahan. She pressed her lips together, a jolt of alarm coursing through her. How on earth did something belonging to a missing man end up on an owl? Suddenly, the owl flapped its wings. Fog swirled around it, and with a soundless leap, it soared into the sky, disappearing beyond the treetops. Olivia clutched the pendant in her hand. It had broken free from the owl's leg. Whatever this strange encounter meant, it was not some random coincidence. She turned off the engine and stared at the forest, the tall pines shrouded by early morning mist. A sliver of doubt tugged at her. She had lost her husband to a climbing accident in these very mountains years ago. Since then, every search and rescue mission felt personal. The sense of urgency that she had suppressed roared to life now. She could not explain why, but she felt certain that following the owl's path would lead her to Robert Callahan. Her radio crackled again, echoing the call for all rangers to join the official search in designated zones. Yet Olivia found herself unable to let this moment pass unexamined. She looked at the engraving one last time, then slipped the pendant into her pocket. The morning sun was rising, its light scattering the fog. Something inside her whispered that the owl was leading her somewhere she needed to go. Maybe it was foolish, but she could not ignore the fear and the fragile hope burning in her chest. Robert Callahan was out there, and she would not stand by, waiting for him to become just another name in the log of unsolved disappearances. Olivia got back into her vehicle and noted the coordinates of where she had spotted the owl. Then she headed toward the nearest ranger station, determined to make sense of the perplexing clue dangling from that bird's leg. Yet as she drove, she felt the forest loom closer, as if leaning in to listen. And in the back of her mind, a thought persisted. That owl was no ordinary creature. Later that morning, Olivia arrived at the ranger station and found it buzzing with the urgency of a missing person case. Posters of Robert Callahan's face were taped to windows and bulletin boards. A tall, soft-spoken professor in his early 50s, Robert had left on a solo excursion into the backcountry 4 days prior. No calls, no signals, just vanished. She placed the pendant in a small evidence envelope, though she hesitated to label it as such. There was something too personal about it. Her eyes lingered on the words, "For Elise, come back safe." It triggered a flood of memories she had tried so hard to bury. She took a moment to collect herself in the hallway. The hum of voices and radio static faded as she remembered the day her husband Sam left for a short climb that should have been easy, the call that he never returned, the guilt, the nightmares, and how she threw herself into her work to cope. Now, confronted with another disappearance, she felt that ache intensify. A phone rang at the front desk, snapping her back to the present. She approached the dispatch officer, who handed her the receiver. The voice on the other end was Elise Callahan's, trembling with exhaustion. "Is there any news?" Elise asked. "I'm desperate for an update. I'll search myself if it comes to that." Olivia introduced herself and offered what little comfort she could. She mentioned finding something that might belong to Robert. Elise grew quiet, then softly confirmed that the engraved pendant was indeed a gift she had given her husband just before his trip. She asked Olivia to hold on to it, her voice catching with hope. After the call, Olivia sat at her desk. She scrolled through files on Robert, gleaning bits and pieces of his life. He was on sabbatical from teaching. He had rented a small cabin near the edge of the forest. Friends mentioned he seemed restless, searching for meaning. None of it explained how a forest owl came to wear his keepsake. Xavier Ruiz, a fellow ranger, appeared by her side. He was younger than Olivia, practical to a fault, and had a habit of dismissing oddities as coincidences. He glanced at her notes, then raised a skeptical brow. "An owl, Olivia? You're chasing a clue left by a bird?" he said, his tone more puzzled than mocking. She stood, meeting his gaze. "This is the biggest lead we have right now. Robert's missing, and we found his property attached to that owl's leg." Xavier sighed. "Search teams are combing the main trails. If you want to trek out into the wilderness after a hunch, that's your call. Just don't expect the rest of the station to rearrange the search based on an animal acting strangely." He turned away, leaving Olivia with a sense of isolation. She understood the skepticism, but something about the encounter on that foggy road would not let her rest. She felt compelled to learn the truth. That afternoon, she gathered her equipment: maps, water, a first aid kit, and a small camera. She pinned Robert's photo to her dashboard as a reminder of who she was searching for. Before heading out, she made one more phone call to Elise, promising to keep her updated. The day waned as Olivia drove back to the spot where the owl had stood. The quiet around her was heavy, almost reverent, broken only by the hum of her tires on the winding road. She recalled the radio alert earlier: "All units, keep an eye out," standard procedure, though there had been no further word from the main search teams. She parked by a bend in the road where pines clustered thickly. As she stepped out, the wind carried the faint smell of wet earth and conifer needles. The last strips of daylight filtered through the high branches, painting the forest in amber tones. Olivia set off on foot, heading toward the direction the owl had flown at dawn. She moved deeper into the trees, heart hammering with a mix of dread and anticipation. She could not ignore the parallels to her husband's final trek. That day, he too had left in search of something. She whispered a small prayer that this time the outcome would be different. Morning light caught on fresh dew as Olivia navigated the forest floor. She came early, determined to pick up any trail that might have been overlooked. The earthy scent of pine mingled with the crisp mountain air. Each step sank into damp soil. She thought about the missing hiker, Robert. Days without contact spelled trouble. If he was injured or lost, the clock was ticking. She scanned the ground for footprints or any sign of disturbance: a snapped branch, a patch of flattened grass. Her patience paid off when she noticed a scrap of cloth snagged on a thorn bush, faded green stained with what looked like dried blood. She crouched down, heart racing. Could it be Robert's? She bagged the evidence, then paused. A sense of being watched crept over her. Standing slowly, she surveyed the area. No visible movement except the trembling leaves in a gentle breeze. Yet the feeling persisted. A soft flutter of wings passed overhead. She looked up. For the briefest moment, she caught sight of the same owl perched on a high branch. Its blue eyes seemed to meet hers. Then, like a gust of wind, it vanished into the canopy. Despite her years of service, she had never experienced something quite like this. An owl that lingered near evidence of a missing person. Could it be coincidence? Or was this bird acting as a silent guide? She continued onward, eventually coming across a set of footprints near a shallow creek. They looked recent, and the stride suggested someone moving at a cautious pace. She snapped a few photos and used her GPS device to log the coordinates. If these tracks led to Robert, time was of the essence. She pressed on, ignoring her own fatigue. As afternoon approached, her radio beeped. She recognized Xavier's voice, checking on her location. She reported the cloth and footprints, trying to keep the excitement out of her tone. His reply carried a trace of doubt. "Just be careful," he said. "That area can get tricky, and keep in mind, we don't know if those footprints belong to Callahan." She exhaled. "Understood. I'll be in touch." The deeper she went, the fewer signs of human activity she found. No empty snack wrappers, no old campfires. She was heading beyond the usual trails. Even the forest seemed different here, the canopy denser, the underbrush thicker. Occasionally, she spotted small game trails, faint lines in the foliage. Then she stumbled upon another clue, a single piece of laminated paper pinned under a rock. It was an old ID card fragment with the name R. Calla, partially visible. Half of it was torn away. The photo was water damaged, but it was enough for Olivia to confirm that it belonged to Robert Callahan. Her pulse quickened. This was no random hunch. Something had drawn Robert off the main path into these isolated woods. She wondered if the owl had indeed carried the pendant away from him or if he had deliberately attached it, hoping someone might find it. The question swirled in her mind as she carefully pocketed the ID. A rustling sound made her spin around. She caught a glimpse of movement, dark shapes slipping between the trees. An animal, a person. She reached for her flashlight, though the midday sun still filtered through the leaves. The underbrush quieted, as if it had swallowed the sound. Unease prickled through her. She felt like a trespasser in a realm guarded by centuries of secrets. Yet the fabric, the footprints, and now the ID left her no choice. Robert was somewhere in this vast wilderness, and she was closer than ever to finding him. Night had fallen when Olivia finally set up a small campsite near a weathered rock formation. She decided to wait until dawn to continue her search, unwilling to risk losing the trail in the darkness. Her tent was modest, just enough shelter from the chill air. Outside, the world was still, but it didn't feel peaceful. It felt charged with an unseen presence. As she warmed a can of soup over a portable stove, her mind wandered to her husband, Sam. She had made a similar camp on her last trip with him. They had laughed by the fire, plotting their next climb, blissfully unaware of the tragedy that awaited. The memory hit her like a wave, a mix of heartache and longing. A distant hoot echoed in the darkness. She turned off her stove. The sound came again, low and haunting. Stepping out of her tent, she strained her eyes in the moonlight. The outline of the owl was barely visible on a nearby branch. Its eyes glowed with a spectral radiance. She whispered into the quiet, "Why are you here?" The owl cocked its head but offered no answer. Suddenly, a crack of branches to her left made her freeze. Her hand went to her flashlight. She directed its beam through the trees, revealing nothing but shifting shadows. Yet the sense of being watched intensified. She retreated inside the tent and zipped it shut. Sleep was elusive. Each whisper of the wind sounded like a voice. She could almost make out words in the rustle of leaves. When exhaustion finally claimed her, she dreamt of Robert calling for help amid towering pines. She dreamt of a faceless figure dragging him deeper into the forest, and always, in the dream's periphery, loomed the silent owl. At dawn, she woke with a start, skin damp with cold sweat. She packed her gear quickly and pressed on, following the faint trails. Around midday, she came upon something even more disturbing, a half-buried structure, as though a shelter or bunker had once stood here. The roof had collapsed, and layers of pine needles covered the remnants. Broken cans and shredded plastic were scattered around. A sense of dread settled in her chest. Inside, she found evidence of a recent presence. Footprints in the dirt, a makeshift bed, and a piece of old rope. Papers lay crumpled on the ground. Some held scribbled phrases like, "He doesn't belong here," and "thief." Another was a crude map with lines radiating from a central point, though it made little sense to her at first glance. Her throat tightened. Was Robert kept here? Or was this a sign of another person living off the grid? She recalled tales of hermits in these mountains, some harmless, some not. Olivia felt an overpowering urge to leave, but her duty held her in place. She lifted a paper and found a name scrawled in pen, Robert. Next to it was an ominous question mark. A branch snapped behind her. She whipped around, heart hammering. For a moment she saw a silhouette, a man. Then it vanished behind the collapsed structure. She rushed outside only to find empty forest, nothing but the echo of her own breath. She stared at the pines, branches swaying gently. The owl's cry sounded in the distance, as if calling her back to the path. Olivia realized she was no longer just searching for a missing hiker. She was unearthing something darker, a hidden thread of hostility in these woods. Midday sunlight filtered through the tree canopy as Olivia followed faint footprints around the collapsed shelter. Her heart thudded with every step, torn between retreat and pressing forward. She had to know who else was lurking here. She had to confirm whether Robert was still alive. She gripped her radio, debating whether to call for backup. The official search parties were sweeping established trails, and she had no clear proof of immediate danger, only the palpable sense of it. Something moved behind a thick pine trunk. She caught a glimpse of a figure in ragged clothes, face partly obscured by a tangled beard and a cap pulled low. He clutched a makeshift spear, carved from a sturdy branch. His eyes glinted with hostility when he realized he'd been spotted. "Stop," Olivia called, raising her hands to show she wasn't looking for a fight. "I'm a park ranger." The man hissed, stepping sideways. Then he spoke in a ragged voice. "You don't belong here. Leave." Olivia stayed firm. "Someone is missing. I'm here to help. Do you know anything about Robert Callahan?" He gave no answer, only narrowed his eyes. In a blur of motion, he lunged forward, thrusting the spear in her direction. She twisted away, stumbling over a rock. Pain shot through her ankle as she hit the ground. Before she could recover, the man vanished into the dense underbrush. Panting, she scrambled upright. Her ankle throbbed, but she forced herself to move, determined not to remain an easy target. She suspected this man was connected to Robert's disappearance. His menacing posture, the scribbled notes about a thief, and the rotting shelter all pointed toward a recluse who had crossed the line into something more dangerous. She limped toward a clearing and nearly jumped when she saw Xavier Ruiz. He must have followed her radio signal. Relief washed over her, though she tried to hide the pain in her leg. "Olivia, I tried to contact you," Xavier said, scanning the trees around them. "What the hell happened?" She told him about the hermit. He listened, brows furrowed. For the first time, doubt left his expression. "This is more serious than I thought. Let me help you back, and we'll call for backup to search for this guy." But Olivia shook her head. Robert could be nearby. That man might have him. She pointed in the direction the figure had fled. If we let him slip away, we lose our only lead. Xavier glanced at the thinning sunlight. "It's going to be dark soon." They heard the soft flapping of wings. The blue-eyed owl appeared again, perched on a branch overlooking the scene. It blinked, as though assessing the two rangers. Neither spoke, but an unspoken understanding passed between them. The owl's presence felt almost like a guidepost in this forsaken place. "All right," Xavier said, resignation in his voice. "We move carefully. We keep an eye out for traps or anything unusual." He reached down, offering Olivia a steadying hand. They advanced together, scanning every shadow. The forest seemed to close in, branches twisting into arcs overhead, and the floor muffled their footsteps. A half-hour passed with no sign of the hermit, though Olivia spotted freshly disturbed moss and bent ferns, proof someone had traveled through recently. Suddenly, Xavier raised his arm, signaling her to stop. He pointed to a crude snare laid out across the ground, thin wire stretched between two trees. Olivia's breath caught. They were dealing with someone who knew how to trap and conceal. She disabled the snare while Xavier kept watch. As they ventured deeper, the owl glided past them, silent as a ghost, its eyes illuminated by a stray shaft of sunlight. It disappeared beyond a cluster of pines. Heart-pounding, Olivia followed. She felt an inexplicable trust in that silent creature, even as fear gnawed at her. When they reached the base of a rocky slope, Olivia's ankle gave out, forcing her to lean against a boulder. Before she could catch her breath, a voice echoed through the pines. "Stay away," it growled. She recognized it as the hermit's. "He's mine to judge." Olivia and Xavier exchanged a tense glance. A confrontation was inevitable. The question was whether Robert was already beyond their help, or if there was still a chance to save him. A single screech from the owl broke the silence, sending a chill through Olivia. She recalled the battered ID card, the pendant with Elise's inscription, and the ominous words scrawled on the notes. "He doesn't belong here." If the hermit believed Robert had taken something, or desecrated something sacred, then Robert could be in grave danger. They pressed on, determined. Olivia's eyes searched for any sign of a hidden bunker or cabin. Her mind reeled with questions about the hermit's intentions, about how he might justify holding someone captive. The forest remained unreadable, an ancient realm that carried secrets in every rustling leaf. The sun's light waned. Shadows stretched across the forest floor. Olivia pushed down her mounting dread. If Robert was alive, every second counted. She steeled herself for the next step, knowing this chase was more than a rescue. It was a confrontation with the darkness buried in these woods, and perhaps with the regret still buried in her own heart. Olivia's foot throbbed with each step, but she pressed on, driven by the certainty that Robert Callahan was near. She and Xavier moved slowly up a slope thick with pine needles. The fragrance of sap and damp soil hung in the air. The forest stretched on, quiet and brooding, as though it carried centuries of unspoken memories. Eventually, they reached a shallow dip in the landscape where a large mound of packed earth had been partially concealed by leaves and loose branches. At first glance, it looked like an overgrown mound, just another swelling of dirt among the pines. But as Xavier moved in for a closer look, he spotted a faint outline of wooden slats beneath the debris. "Help me clear this," he murmured. Together they brushed aside layers of foliage until a hidden entrance came into view, a crude trapdoor set flush with the ground. Thick roots snaked across its edges, indicating it had been there for quite some time. Olivia's heart hammered. "If Robert's in there," she whispered, "we have to be careful." She reached for her flashlight and pulled the door open with a groan of rusted hinges. Stale air billowed out, carrying the scent of mold and unwashed bodies. They descended a short ladder that led into a cramped tunnel. Dirt walls pressed close, supported by half-rotted wooden beams. The darkness was suffocating, relieved only by the flashlight's narrow beam, sweeping left and right in search of any threat. Each step they took echoed through the claustrophobic corridor. Then came a muffled sound, a low moan. Olivia's pulse quickened. She gestured for Xavier to hold, listening intently. Through the stillness came another faint noise, a weak voice that might have been calling for help. They pressed on, bracing themselves for the unknown. The tunnel opened into a small bunker-like room. Wooden planks formed a makeshift floor, and in the corner lay a man, pale, trembling, and bound at the wrists. His clothes were filthy, his face gaunt. Even by flashlight's glow, Olivia recognized him, Robert Callahan. She rushed forward, dropping to her knees. "Robert," she called softly, checking his pulse. He stirred, blinking at the sudden light. A wave of relief surged through her when she felt the faint but steady beat of his heart. She reached for her radio to request immediate medical backup. Before she could say a word, a silhouette filled the doorway. The hermit stood there, shotgun in hand, eyes wild with anger. His voice was low, hoarse as he spoke. "You shouldn't have come here," he hissed. Xavier pivoted, aiming his flashlight directly at the intruder. "Drop the weapon," he ordered, but the hermit only tightened his grip. In a swift move, Olivia tried to maneuver between the hermit and Robert, hoping to shield the wounded man. The hermit barked. He took what wasn't his, trespassed on sacred land. Now you're all part of it." Olivia's mind raced. She recalled the scribbled messages, the sense of a warped logic driving this man. Whatever his beliefs, he was terrified of losing the little world he had carved out in the forest, and he was prepared to defend it at any cost. The hermit raised the shotgun. "Leave, or I promise you'll be sorry." With a trembling voice, Robert managed to speak. "Elise. Please let me see Elise." A violent cough seized him and his words trailed off. Olivia shot Xavier a desperate glance. They had to act. Time slowed as the hermit's finger hovered over the trigger. Then from above, a long, piercing screech rang out, the unmistakable cry of the blue-eyed owl. The noise reverberated through the bunker like an alarm. Startled, the hermit tilted his head for just an instant. It was all Olivia needed. She lunged forward and knocked the shotgun upward. The blast roared, deafening her, sending pellets into the ceiling. Dust and earth rained down in a choking cloud. She cried out as a sudden blow struck her head, dizziness overtaking her. She collapsed to the floor. Her last fleeting image was Xavier grappling with the hermit, the echo of the owl's screech still ringing through the darkness. Then everything went black. Olivia opened her eyes to a dull pounding in her skull. She lay in the dirt, half covered by broken beams. The stale bunker air stung her lungs. She coughed and raised herself on an elbow, blinking away dust in the haze of pain. Across the small space, Xavier had the hermit pinned, though the wild man still writhed in fury. The shotgun clattered nearby, out of reach. With a sudden kick, the hermit broke free and staggered backward, panting. But Xavier's training took over. He tackled the hermit again, wrestling him to the ground until the fight drained out of him. Olivia crawled toward Robert, who lay slumped against the wall, barely conscious. With trembling hands, she untied his wrists and checked his breathing. It was shallow, labored. The stench of sweat and old blood hung in the stale air. She called his name, shaking him gently. His eyelids fluttered. "Elise!" he whispered, voice thick with desperation. Olivia tried to steady him, pressing a hand against his clammy forehead. "It's okay, Robert," she said. "We're going to get you out. Stay with me." Behind her, Xavier managed to bind the hermit's hands with the same rope that had once confined Robert. The man spat and struggled, but exhaustion finally overcame him. With the immediate threat contained, Xavier radioed for backup. His voice shook with urgency as he relayed their location. Olivia shifted her focus back to Robert. "Hang on," she urged, recalling her military medic training. She found a half-empty water bottle in her pack and used it to moisten his parched lips. His eyes opened for a moment, raw gratitude shining through his delirium. Time blurred. Sirens echoed from the direction of the tunnel entrance. Flashlights glimmered, and voices began to fill the bunker. A rescue team, deployed after Xavier's frantic radio call, emerged, offering medical supplies and a stretcher for Robert. The surge of relief nearly brought Olivia to tears. As they lifted Robert up the ladder and into the daylight, Olivia followed, her head spinning from the blow she had taken. At the surface, the forest air felt almost shockingly fresh after the oppressive darkness below. She steadied herself against a tree, eyes scanning the canopy. Above her, silent as ever, perched the owl. For a moment it gazed down, as if overseeing the final moments of the rescue. Then it took flight, wings silhouetted against the afternoon sun. Robert was rushed to an ambulance, waiting on a nearby dirt path. Xavier escorted the hermit, who mumbled incoherent protests, eyes darting wildly. Olivia watched them go, caught between relief and the sudden overwhelm of everything that had transpired. As medical personnel checked her vitals, she thought of Elise Callahan. At least she could deliver good news. Robert was alive. The bitter tang of regret still lingered in her mind, a reminder of her husband's fate and how she hadn't been able to save him. This time was different. She had followed the signs and perhaps the guidance of a silent, blue-eyed guardian. Before the ambulance doors shut, Robert's eyes opened again. His gaze found Olivia. He lifted a trembling hand in thanks, then let it fall as exhaustion pulled him back into unconsciousness. In that moment, Olivia looked once more to the skies, heart pounding with gratitude. The owl was gone. Long hours passed. By the time Olivia reached the hospital, the sun was sinking low, and the news vans had already gathered outside. Word had spread about the unusual rescue story. Journalists clamored for interviews about the ranger who followed an owl to find a missing hiker. She avoided them, slipping inside quietly. She found Elise Callahan pacing in the waiting area, her face drawn with worry. When Elise saw Olivia, she rushed forward, eyes brimming with tears. "They said he's going to be okay," she managed through trembling lips. Olivia nodded. "He needs rest and monitoring for dehydration and infection, but he'll recover." The words came out gently, a reassurance she wished she'd heard in her own time of loss. Elise bowed her head, sobbing in relief. After a moment, she gathered her composure. "I can't thank you enough. Everyone else dismissed my hope, but you never gave up." Olivia felt her throat tighten. Memories of searching for her husband rose unbidden, the pleas to keep searching, the nights spent hoping for a miracle. Now at least one family would be spared that lingering ache. "I only followed what made sense," she said softly, "even if it didn't make sense to everyone else." They sat together in the waiting room, accompanied by the faint beeps and hushed footsteps of hospital staff. Outside the window, the sky turned a deep purple, streaked with pink. On a table nearby lay the evidence envelope containing the pendant inscribed with "For Elise, come back safe." Olivia handed it to her. Elise cradled the pendant in her palm. "He never took it off," she said, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Thank you for returning it." A short while later, Xavier appeared, a bandage on his arm from the skirmish with the hermit. He offered Olivia a half smile, relief shining in his eyes. "They've got the suspect in custody," he said quietly. "He's raving about protecting sacred lands, but hopefully the courts will get him the help he needs. This might take a while to process." The weight of the day's events pressed down on Olivia, but she managed a nod. "At least we saved Robert. That's what matters." Before she left, she slipped into the curtained area where Robert lay. His eyes were closed in sleep, a tangle of IV lines at his side. Elise stood nearby, gently holding his hand. Even in the dim hospital light, Olivia could see his breathing was more regular now, color slowly returning to his face. A nurse approached with a sympathetic smile. "You did a good thing today," she whispered to Olivia. Stepping out into the hallway, Olivia felt a wave of exhaustion. Physical, mental, emotional. Yet under that fatigue lay a quiet sense of redemption. Not for her husband's death, she knew that wound might never fully heal, but for finding a path forward. She had listened to her instincts, no matter how unorthodox, and for once, things had turned out all right. Outside, the flash of cameras nearly blinded her. She shielded her eyes and quickened her pace, not in the mood for attention, but she couldn't suppress a small smile. When someone shouted, "Officer Harrington, can you confirm reports about an owl guiding you?" she simply gave a polite wave and slipped into her car. As night settled, she couldn't resist one last glance at the rooftops around the hospital. She saw no flash of wings, no silhouette of a watching bird. Still, she murmured her thanks to the creature that had crossed her path, whatever mysterious force had guided it. A few days later, Olivia found herself alone on a quiet trail just outside her hometown. The sun set in a blaze of gold and orange over the distant peaks. The events of the previous days had stirred media interest, but eventually the small-town chatter subsided. Everyone had their own theories about the miracle owl. She walked slowly, inhaling the scent of pine. Her ankle still twinged, but was healing. The scars on her heart, she knew, would remain, both old and new, yet there was solace in the hush of the forest, in knowing that she had done what she could. When she reached a clearing, she paused. Memories of the frantic search for her husband returned, reminding her how drastically a single moment could shift a person's life. This time, though, she felt a gentle acceptance. She had saved Robert from the fate Sam had met. In a way, it was a tribute to her husband's memory, a way to honor all he had been. A rustle of leaves made her turn. Elise Callahan stood there, hands in her jacket pockets. She approached with a grateful smile. I wanted to see this place," Elise said, glancing around. "Robert told me about the forest and how he always felt a calling here. I guess I just needed to feel closer to whatever drew him in." Olivia nodded, understanding. They stood side by side for a moment, letting silence speak for them. Finally, Elise broke it. "You won't believe this, but 2 nights ago I saw that owl. It was perched on the window ledge outside the hospital room where Robert was recovering. I looked right into its eyes." She paused, perhaps searching for words to capture the strangeness and wonder of it. The owl stayed there for a moment, then flew off into the dark. I think, her voice caught, I think it was saying goodbye. Olivia felt a chill and a quiet warmth at the same time. "It brought us together," she said simply. "Maybe it had one more visit left." Elise's eyes shone with unshed tears, and she nodded in gratitude. After a brief embrace, she turned and headed back toward the town, the soft crunch of her footsteps fading in the twilight. Olivia watched her go, heart full of unspoken thanks. In the dimming light, she continued walking, the forest path growing darker. A breeze stirred the branches overhead. She glanced up. For a moment she imagined she saw a pair of wings silhouetted against the sky. They glided gracefully past the treetops, then vanished beyond the horizon. She couldn't be certain, but it felt real enough to stir a quiet awe in her chest. Standing there, she whispered her thanks, to the forest for its mysteries, to the owl for its guidance, to the second chance she'd been given to save a life. She closed her eyes, breathing in the lingering scent of pine needles. When she finally reopened them, the last rays of sunlight dipped below the mountain ridge, painting the clouds in shades of purple and gold. She made her way back toward the trailhead, each footstep echoing with renewed purpose. In her mind, she could still see the gentle flutter of wings, as if they had brushed a path for her in the sky. And in her heart, she carried the quiet promise that life would always hold secrets worth seeking, if only she would listen closely enough to hear their call. And so she walked on, alone in the settling dusk, a final image lingering in her thoughts. 2 brilliant blue eyes, glowing with the silent wisdom of the wilderness, guiding her forward into whatever tomorrow might bring.